Good evening. Timothy McVeigh died by long-delayed appointment with his executioner this week. A nasty piece of work with a screw loose, but judged reasonably enough as morally and criminally responsible for the worst single terrorist act in American history. Some of his victims, survivors of the Oklahoma bombing and relatives of the 168 people he killed there, watched him die on closed-circuit television. The camera was placed just above his face as they injected him with 3 different drugs to make him unconscious, then shut down his heart and his lungs. He died with little apparent pain and no remorse. Many of those who watched him being killed were disappointed on both counts and said later it had not given them what their counselling had obviously described as closure. As far as the American state was concerned, capital punishment in this case had achieved just that: justice in the form of a punishment morally equivalent to the crime, and deterrence. This side of the Atlantic there was a wave of repugnance. There had been no executions here since 1965, none in Europe at all since 77. The argument that it's barbaric and brutalising for all concerned holds sway here, at least in the media and amongst democratically elected politicians who seem comfortable about ignoring public opinion that's consistently and overwhelmingly in favour of the death penalty. It's a question of moral justice then. For the very worst of crimes, if not capital punishment, then what? Our moral maze. Live tonight, our panel, Professor Ian Hargreaves, editor-turned-academic, Dr. David Cook, the medical ethicist from Oxford, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, and Janet Radcliffe-Richards, the philosopher from University College London. Unusually, tonight our panel have the same view on the issue on capital punishment. They're all against it, but for interestingly different reasons. Ian Hargreaves, what's yours?
Well, I lived in America in the early 1980s and loved it. But in one respect, I knew I could never be an American citizen or salute the American flag, because I could not have the kind of respect you need for your government and your country, where the government is prepared to murder in cold blood any of its citizens. This was an act of the federal government, the killing of McVeigh. That government has debased itself and lowered its moral authority in the world.
David Cook?
Well, I'm against legalised killing, not just because of the risk of mistakes or the difficulty in understanding any sense of deterrence, but if we really believe that the punishment should fit the crime, it's not just about retribution, it's justice and mercy, and that means the possibility of change, reformation, and redeeming the good out of evil.
Claire Fox?
I'm opposed, but I'm not trying to pretend it's a moral principle. I'm not a pacifist. The reason I'm opposed to the death penalty is because I don't trust the state when it comes to deciding on guilt and innocence. It's too frequently a politicised decision, and I think of the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, and the huge number of black people who find themselves on death row in the US. And secondly, I want the law to stand apart, above from society, objective somehow. And there's something about this kind of death penalty that's got a kind of therapeutic retribution for the victims. So it's not so much that we're asked to pay a debt to society, but more a debt to the victims. And I find that subjective lynch mob scary thought.
Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
Punishment is doing something deliberately nasty, and capital punishment is a particularly nasty thing to do, so you need a good justification for it. And one of our problems is that we are very incoherent on our justifications for punishment. I think that the retributivist theory that people really deserve punishment just does not hold water, and that the only possible justification for punishment is that it's good for society in some way. But I would want very good reason indeed that capital punishment was good for society before I condone something as intrinsically unpleasant.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Partly because all our panellists are opposed to capital punishment, the majority of our witnesses tonight are for it, starting with Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter Hitchens, you've actually witnessed 2 executions in America yourself, haven't you? So root us in this discussion in some sort of reality. Briefly, if you will, would you describe the execution you watched in Georgia?
This was an electrocution by an electric chair execution of a man called Nicholas Lee Ingram, who had tortured and then murdered a man called J.C. Sawyer. He'd also tortured his wife, but had failed to kill her. There's no doubt in my mind that he was guilty. The execution was an intensely unpleasant experience, and one that I wouldn't recommend anybody to watch, but I felt that as a supporter of the death penalty and as a reporter in the United States, it was my job to see what I had supported. Briefly, what you see in a small chamber in which you're separated from it by a glass partition is somebody being strapped into a chair, which is in itself a rather macabre experience, and then his face covered by a cowl and him attached to electrical cables at the head and leg. And then after a brief interval and a signal being given, a man-made bolt of lightning is shot through him, and there's the most tremendous whipping crack shoots through the room like a shockwave as the body tenses and smacks against the chair. And that's it. And when you've seen it, you feel several years older.
And yet you're in favour of it?
Yes, I am in favour of it, yes.
Ian Hargreaves?
Why do you think, Peter, that you and I, we're roughly the same age, we're both journalists, we're both British, have such an instinctively, trenchantly, deeply different view about this?
I don't know why you have the view that you have. The view that I have is actually shared by most people and is held particularly by those who are aware of the nature of murder, a uniquely obscene and disgusting crime which has to have a unique response from the justice system.
But the fact that you don't think anybody else should watch it, I mean, you once said that you regarded yourself, as it were, taking that responsibility on behalf of others, as if this was something that needed to be witnessed, as if you felt a responsibility to witness it.
It's necessary for it to be witnessed anyway by independent people. If the state is going to put people to death, it's necessary that there should be independent witnesses there to make sure that it is done properly and that it's not bungled. But that's another issue. As I say, I felt that as someone who has for some time believed that the death penalty should be reintroduced in this country and had argued for it, that it was only right for me to see the thing which I had in a way willed, so that I could judge for myself whether I still approved of it. And I did, and I do. I think that's part of the job of a journalist. We also go to wars and revolutions and other unpleasant things, so we can tell people what they're like and allow them to make a judgment. That's our job, to be where other people can't go.
But there is something in your description of it which is almost an aesthetic, a moral aesthetic, a desire to capture its horror. And one of the arguments that you've used is that Timothy McVeigh should have been also killed in the electric chair rather than by lethal injection, because you find lethal injection too cool a process in some way. How can you make that moral distinction?
Justice is about drama. Justice is a huge public drama designed to demonstrate in the hope that it may turn out to be true.
So why shouldn't it be put on the internet?
The wrongdoing is punished.
So why shouldn't it be put on the internet and on television, or done in public on Tower Hill as it used to be?
Because that would demean huge numbers of people watching it, would become an obscene public spectacle. The fact that it is done and known to be done is one thing. The fact that it is done in front of a crowd as an entertainment and a spectacle is something entirely different. Charles Dickens supported the death penalty, but he was bitterly opposed to it being in public, and it was his writing which actually halted public execution in this country. It's two different things entirely to say people should be executed in a way which has moral force, and to say that it should be done in a public square.
How can you say in one allegedly coherent sentence that part of the purpose is drama, and that the effect of witnessing the drama is to demean you, and yet not be open to the argument that the very process is demeaning of the population on whose behalf the act is done?
Well, I think if you can't distinguish between 5 or 6 people in a sealed room seeing something and a milling crowd in which drinks and hot dogs are being sold seeing something, then I can't help you. But it seems to me to be fairly obvious.
David Cook.
I'm interested in this notion that perhaps the way in which you kill them, the more unpleasant the better. Should we be frying them, poisoning them, or hanging them?
Not the more unpleasant. But it does. Well, I think the argument about whether it should be the electric chair or whether it should be the gallows is a technical argument, which I think is futile for us to go into here. What I do feel is that lethal injection does not actually serve the purpose which it is supposed to serve.
What's the purpose?
It's partly because it looks like a medical procedure. And therefore it confuses people about what it actually is that's taking place. Is it an act of euthanasia? Is it the putting down of an inconvenient person? Is it actually a medical act comparable to the Nazi putting down of people?
Is the purpose of the act retribution, or is the purpose of the act deterrence, or a little bit of both?
Both.
Right.
Janet Radcliffe.
Now, there's a problem about both, because retribution and deterrence are quite opposed in that retribution looks backward to the crime and deterrence looks forward. And there are a lot of cases where the two give different results. So what would you do in cases where the two came apart?
Well, you'd have to tell me what you mean by that, because I don't...
There are some cases where you might have deterrence by getting a disproportionately high punishment, and some cases where you might get no deterrence by letting off a really wicked criminal.
Well, the purpose of deterrence is not its effect on the person who's being executed, but the effect on other people. And
I'm talking about other
we
people.
can argue about that. I mean, it is demonstrable that the reintroduction of execution in Texas has reduced the murder rate in the Houston area far faster than it's reduced in other parts of the United States. Though, of course, abolitionists will immediately say it's not because of the death penalty, but it does happen to be so. And there is an argument for suggesting it is powerfully deterrent. The point about retribution is that murder is a crime which cannot, by definition, be forgiven. The victim isn't there to forgive it.
Right, so
and
would
we
you...
can't forgive on behalf of the victim. It's obscene for us
Peter,
to imagine that we can.
do you think
Claire?
that all murders then should be dealt with in this way?
No, I think that courts should be free to impose this sentence where they think it's appropriate.
So you therefore recognise that there are differences in the motives of the way why people kill people,
Well, I think
the
that
context in which they kill them, and therefore there must be some question as to making a decision about killing somebody might be something that's provisional, changes depending on the colour of the state or the government, the political outlook and so on.
Look, I think that if a particular society, and in the United States each of the 50 states can choose whether it executes or not, if a particular society wishes to use execution as part of its retributive and deterrent apparatus, then it should be free to do so. What's notable about this country is that the Parliament here refuses even to consider it and holds free votes on it, which avoid any kind of responsibility to the electorate by those taking the decision. They simply aren't answerable to it because it never features at an election. So democracy doesn't exist in this case.
Okay, my final thing would be, what on earth is wrong with depriving somebody of their freedom for a very long time?
A great deal is wrong with it, and if you've visited any prisons, you'll know that it's they are disgusting.
Freedom, Peter. If you think that
they're
going
disgusting
to
places.
prison is a nice thing to do, even if you've got a telly in your
No, they are disgusting places. I think it's far more humane to execute someone than to lock them away till their soul is destroyed for 30 years.
What a favour you're doing us all.
Peter Hitchens, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Daniel Troy, who's a Washington lawyer, an associate scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's on the line from Washington now. Mr. Troy, a lot of people here found the McVeigh execution repellent, either in principle or in its practice. But presumably in America, a lot of people thought it wholly right. But because people want capital punishment, does that necessarily make it inherently moral justice?
The mere fact that people may want it may not necessarily make it moral justice, but moral philosophers have identified basically three key reasons to support the death penalty, and one of them is linked to the views of society. They are moral, deterrence, and incapacitation. And by far the most important argument is a moral one, and although it may seem paradoxical, we affirm the value of life by saying that if you take the lives of others, especially repeatedly or on a mass basis, your own life will be forfeit. Also, a justice system shouldn't be too far removed from its society's values, and as you point out, the overwhelming majority of Americans support the death penalty, as have many societies across space and time. And a government makes decisions all the time which cost lives. When you decide to build a dam, necessarily people are going to die. You know that in advance. You may not know who the person is who's going to die, but that in some senses could be a more morally problematic decision. Nonetheless, governments make those decisions all the time.
I understand. Let me stop you there and hand you over to David Cook. David?
I'm interested in this moral argument, whether there's some kind of innate moral sense that people have, which is retributive.
I used exactly that phrase in a Los Angeles Times article. There is an innate moral sense that people have. I think it's reflected in the Bible and has been reflected in society for many years.
Well, can you help me then understand why only then 2/3 of Americans are in favour if it's totally innate?
Well, I think that many people, the fact that it's innate, it may be innate for us to have compassion. That doesn't mean that everybody has compassion. It may be innate or natural for most people to be attracted to members of the opposite sex, it doesn't mean that it's the case in all cases. And I'm not suggesting any equivalence between the two. I'm just trying to point out that there are phenomena that do not universally occur.
Right. I'm interested in where there is a universal agreement, because on the one side you've 90% of all executions happen in places like China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the US, whereas since 1990, 37 countries have banned capital punishment. So what happened to an 8 then?
Well, I believe that it is the case, as someone said, that the majorities of the people in many European countries, if you poll them, continue to believe that capital punishment is appropriate in certain circumstances. It is the case that
they keep
often
re-electing people who will actually vote against capital punishment.
That may be because they're voting on other issues, but
Right.
it is particularly elite culture that is opposed to the death penalty, and one can suggest that maybe one reason for that is elites are frankly more removed from the consequences of violent crime.
Can we go back to the Bible then? It's interesting that in the New Testament, Jesus finds a woman taken in adultery. The punishment was capital punishment, and Jesus says, go and sin no more. How do you square the Bible's view with this?
Well, I'm Jewish, and I refer to the Old Testament. The Old Testament does say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
But that was a way of limiting evil. It was a way of limiting punishment.
That's true. It was ensuring that it be proportional. And what the Jewish rabbis did, the Sanhedrin did, is they erected all sorts of procedural barriers to ensure that there were very few executions and that they only occurred when people had adequate notice.
Luther King used to say that if you take an eye for an eye, then you end up with everybody being blind.
I don't think that's true, since people don't go around putting out other people's eyes. And that actually raises there is evidence that the death penalty actually deters murder. A recent econometric analysis, which just came out from Emory University, suggested that every execution in the United States reduced the murder rate by 18 lives with a margin of error of 10. So each execution was, by the most sophisticated analysis ever done, shown to save between 8 and 28 people. Now, that's not enough, but I think that the utilitarian argument buttresses the moral argument and suggests that there's a common sense view which people are sort of educated out of, which supports the death penalty.
Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
You say that you think this idea is innate, and I think David Cook's right in saying there are problems about that. But why do you think that the fact that something's innate, if it is, shows that it's good and that we should follow it morally? Why shouldn't we just regard this as a moral aberration which we should be trying to get rid of?
Well, it's hard to argue that it's a moral aberration given that it has been a part of Western civilization and Western society for so long, and that it is reflected in not just the Bible, but in many, many legal codes, and many people continue to hold to it. Now, that just the fact that something is ancient and well regarded and held by many people doesn't necessarily make it right, but it seems to me that the burden shifts to those who would argue that this position is wrong. And in the case of someone who is a recidivist or mass murderer, I think that that's a hard case to make to most people.
But people used to think that slavery was right for a long time, that the subordination of women was right for a long time. They've changed that now. Why are you so convinced that they shouldn't change, not about deterrence, but about capital punishment?
Again, I think the question is, where does the burden of proof lie? I would argue that the burden of proof lies on your side, to have to try and articulate convincingly why it is immoral for the state to say to somebody who chooses to blow up 168 people, including 19 children, knowing that they're there, that your life is forfeit because of the heinous actions that you've taken.
Your argument seems to be that the victims of crime are more likely, people closest to the victims of crime are more likely to want capital punishment. Isn't it the case, though, that if your child was just run over by somebody, that you would want to kill, lynch and murder the person who's driving the car? Isn't it the role of law and the role of civilization to stand above the immediate hurt and pain of victims and to try and draw some rational and reasonable decisions? Surely you're simply encouraging us to feel the pain of the victims with whatever the consequence.
Well, I agree with that. I'm not in favor of vigilantism, but what we do as a society is we don't turn the killer over to the victim's family. That's what was done in ancient society. Instead, we only apply the death penalty in certain limited circumstances with many, many procedural safeguards, and I actually think there should be probably more procedural safeguards. I would impose an beyond any doubt standard rather than beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
Ian Hargreaves, the last question.
Mr. Troy, you talked about the liberal elites that won't go along with your argument, and you accuse them, in something you said, of being reluctant to differentiate between right and wrong. What evidence is there of a reluctance to make that differentiation between somebody like me, who says a grotesque crime like McVeigh should result in indefinite imprisonment, and yours, which says that he should be killed? Why is your position morally better than mine?
I guess I would ask you, again, I think the burden of proof lies on your side to articulate, given that most people think that the death penalty is appropriate, for you to articulate why it's morally wrong. But let me say that
but I'm not disagreeing that there's a horrible crime here. I'm not failing to understand that there's right and wrong here.
The problem with the canard that there is life in prison without parole is that it doesn't always work that way, as, for example, the release of terrorist murderers in Britain as part of the Irish peace process teaches. Of state inmates in the United States who were serving time for murder in 1984, at least 810 had killed 821 people following those convictions.
The canard in your approach is that innocent people sometimes get murdered by the state.
There is not a single credible example of any innocent person executed in the United States under the modern death penalty system. You can't name me a single case.
I'm going to stop you there, Daniel Troy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Our next witness is John Schlapperbersky, who's now a psychotherapist at the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture, but once was an opponent of the white minority government in South Africa during the apartheid years, who was imprisoned and tortured. I think yourself, and certainly was in prison where people were tortured and executed. Would you like to see those who committed those kind of crimes against friends of yours, people who believe the same things as you did, would you like to see them executed in turn?
We used to dream of it. We used to think about what would happen when the power balance shifted. But during the many years of the struggle against apartheid, people went through an experience that actually shifted their own frame of reference. And when the new government came into power, after the elections in 1994, and with the appointment of Nelson Mandela, one of the first things the new government did in South Africa was abolish the death penalty. And
you were in favour of that?
Oh, yes.
So how did, just very briefly, because we're going to unpack all this, how and why did your frame of reference, as you put it, shift?
Well, there are several things to be said about this.
Oh, just a couple.
When I was detained in South Africa, I was held in the prison that was the main execution site for the country. And they were hanging...
This is Pretoria, presumably?
Yes, Pretoria Central Prison. They were hanging 2 or 3 people a day. The place in which I was held in solitary confinement, I was never exposed to the people in the condemned cells, but the section in which I was detained was just above theirs. And every night, through the months I was in prison, I would listen to the men in the condemned cells singing. And they would sing right through the night before an execution. And the songs would be the last experience these condemned men took with them to their deaths. Now, there's no doubt many of those who were executed had done appalling things, and in a debate of this kind, part of what gets in the way of a clear analysis of what's happening is the sense of people being appalled and dismayed, very aroused, very shaken by the enormity of what's under discussion, like the McVeigh issue. So, without doubt, many brutal and dangerous people were executed by the state in Pretoria during the years, but many people who were not were executed too.
But what was it about the singing and that somehow changed your emotional frame of reference as well as your logical one?
The exposure to the humanity of the people about to meet their end. I mean, the sound of that singing will be with me all my life.
Because of the consciousness of their humanity.
Indeed.
Claire Fox.
I feel your description is just a description that we can all recognise as human beings, of somebody, that the empathy one might feel with somebody about to meet their maker, metaphorically. But I also feel that were I in circumstances where people were being executed and killed routinely by the apartheid regime, that everybody who was victim to that would have some justification to kill people back. And that's often what liberation struggles are. And I support that. I can't really understand why you can't see that that is not the same as the death penalty. Fighting back against oppression seems to me to be an illegitimate taking of life, whether they're singing or not.
Yes. Sometimes, of course, the fight against oppression, against evil, requires the commission of what might be construed as evil deeds. But victory against evil, I think, imposes a burden on the victors to actually take a stance that isn't the symmetrical opposite, because the symmetrical opposite is often just the same. And in the argument about capital punishment, what's often lost sight of is the inherent web of, I think, quite pernicious contradictions that advocates of the death penalty, or even apologists for it, are actually caught up in, because we are, after all, addressing action of such gravity. I mean, people have done such appalling things as to warrant the death penalty, but when we ourselves say you've done something so terrible as to take human life, and we are therefore going to take human life,
Right.
This is something so contradictory.
But one of the reasons I don't like the death penalty is because it seems to me that it doesn't allow you to pay your debt to society and then, as it were, go off and do something. I mean, you can never, ever pay your debt to society. It's done. You're dead. End of it. But if you take something like the therapeutic model that we now see in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Mission, it seems you can never pay your debt to society that way either, because you have to keep on saying sorry and going through therapy and introspection all the time. I just think that's not helpful either. I want people to be able to have the chance to go to jail and then get out if they've done their time. Do you not see the problem?
Well, I think there are things getting mixed up in what you're saying, if you don't mind me saying so, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not a therapeutic procedure. It was a call for testimony and an opportunity for the testimonial approach, the opportunities for people to actually tell the truth about what took place, to take primacy over principles of retributive justice. Therapy was not a part of that consideration at all. However, if we're going to talk about the therapeutic model...
No, let's move on from that. David,
can we look at two model arguments that we hear from those who are in favour of capital punishment? One is that actually it takes human life seriously, that actually in using this ultimate penalty, it shows that the taking of human life is so awful you're outside the human family.
Mm-hmm. Well, that itself is such a contradictory stance. And the best way, in my view, to bring out the contradiction is to look at the relationship between a mother and child. I'm a therapist, and that I go back to early damage to look at later damage in adult life. If we look at the relationship between a mother and a child, if the child's done something violent, and the mother says, it's wrong to do violent things, I'm going to slap you, or beat you up, the mother is imposing on that child two diametrically opposed messages. The one that it's wrong to be violent, and the other that I'm going to be violent to you.
Some people would find it difficult to see a mother-child pattern is equal to those who perpetrate murder. But let me offer the other concern that's expressed, that capital punishment, those who are opposed to capital punishment are much more interested in the... it's a concern about victims rather than about perpetrators. And in the end, it's the perpetrators who must pay the penalty. Otherwise, we're not really taking the pain, the suffering of victims' families seriously.
The pain and suffering of victims and victims' families has to be taken very seriously, and I'll come to that in a moment, if I may. But what I'm inviting is not a comparison between a mother-child scenario and a murderer-victim scenario, but some consideration of the stance taken, in this case by the state or the adult who assumes a moral authority. And moral authority calls for just that, moral authority. And if moral authority is invoked on the basis that life is sacred and should not be violated, then to violate life in defense of the very authority you're invoking is such a contradiction that you lose your moral authority.
John Schlapper-Birsky, thank you very much indeed. And on this particular subject, there was a compelling programme on Radio 4 this morning, one of three, called Forgive and Forget. If you were unlucky enough to miss it this morning, they're on again in July. I warmly recommend you to hear it. Our last witness is Neil Clark, who's a teacher who's for the death penalty, not from the right, but from the socialist, old Labour, left. From that perspective, Neil, what's the most persuasive argument for the death penalty? Do you think retribution, justice, shall we say, or deterrence?
I think that the death penalty is a statement by society that it values human life. I mean, this point's already been made, that it is the strongest statement by the society we live in, that human life is extremely precious, and that the taking of that has to be taken with very, very seriously indeed.
Janet Radcliffe-Richards.
Do you think there's no other way we could make that statement strongly? Is this the only way you think it's possible?
Well, I think forgiveness is one way we could look, but for murder there can be no forgiveness because I think Peter Hitchens said that the person who has been killed cannot forgive. He's no longer here to forgive, and that we can't forgive in his place, his or her place.
But we have decided as a society to be against it. So why do you think this is wrong?
Well, have we? It's, I think, a fault of the democratic process, where every opinion poll has shown that the vast majority, 83%, in the latest opinion poll yesterday, showed in favour of the death penalty in Britain. So I don't think you can say that we have decided. I think the liberal elite who control most of the Western democracies have decided that.
Now, the interesting question, though, here is why you think the liberal elite is wrong about this and the majority is right, when you consider that most of the things in the history of humanity that we regard as advances have been made by the educated people against the instincts and wishes of the mass. Now, most things, like the abolition of slavery, of servitude of various sorts, of certainly the subjection of women, have come about through the efforts of the intellectuals.
I think certainly on the death penalty, the fact is that what we call the liberal elite and the middle classes, or whatever label we want to put on them, live very much away from the consequences of violent crime in our society. I've been out in Hackney, I've been in the inner cities recently, and I've seen the extent of the huge problem we have in this country with hard drugs. And to quote the National Criminal Service, Intelligence Service actually said that this country is now awash with hard drugs, and that's a major problem which blights the lives of a large number of people in this country.
There's no doubt you're right about that, and there's no doubt that the liberal elite may not see all of this, but in order to make that argument work, you need to make a connection between the death penalty and these things that are happening. And most of the liberal elite who are against the death penalty think that that case has not been made on statistical grounds.
I could only contrast the position in Britain with that of Singapore.
But that's only one case.
And other countries that
freedom reigns and civil liberties.
Well, let's try a more pertinent comparison. Why do you think that the rate of murder and the level of violent crime generally is so much lower in Europe than it is in the United States, where the death penalty and indeed the level of incarceration is so much higher?
Well, there are certainly certain aspects of American society which I would not agree with, and particularly the major problem there, I think, is the ease with which people can obtain firearms. I think that is a major factor in the American crime statistics.
That certainly is a factor, but isn't it also true that the ease with which Americans can bear firearms is itself part of a moral position about not what you say, the showing huge respect for the sanctity of life, but actually life is relatively cheaply tradable in that society, even by the state?
Well, I think that we have to look at the way that America has American history and the way it's evolved. The gun has played a key part in American society ever since independence, basically, and the frontier mentality, the frontier ideology, and the right to carry firearms.
You don't like that, but you like Singapore. So you think that we, like Singapore, should have signs up at Heathrow Airport saying anybody caught bringing drugs into this country will be executed?
Yes. And
you think that what good do you think that would do as a matter of interest?
I think first of all we have to be aware of the huge drugs problem we have in this country with Class A drugs, crack cocaine in London, £1 billion market there. I think the argument about the deterrent for the death penalty has most credence when applied to the case of hard drug smuggling.
So the fact that a proportion of people bringing those drugs in would have had them planted on them in some way and they would still be executed, what would you make of that as a moral consequence?
Well, I do believe that that there are conscious decisions taken by the major hard drug dealers in the world as to which countries are soft touches for being able to bring in drugs into the country, and Britain, unfortunately, is one of those.
David Cook.
I wonder if you could just help me. I want to give an example not of a liberal elite, but of a man whose daughter was a nurse and who was standing at a war memorial service and was bombed. And the next morning, that man was able to say publicly, "I forgive the people who did this." And he went on to spend his life in trying to bring about change and reform and reconciliation. Don't you think that's a proper kind of forgiveness?
Well, that was his particular line. You're talking about Gordon
Wilson.
Wilson, yes, of course, there. I think if we're talking about premeditated terrorist crimes, I would be in favour of the death penalty for those.
And for adultery as well? I mean, how far you go? No, drugs are going to be condemned. So why not? Because Saudi Arabia, it would be permissible?
The key element here is justice, and absolutely crucial to that is the idea that the punishment should be proportionate to the crime. Taking of life is murder, and of course the person who commits murder.
Claire Foxsham.
Before we write off the masses as a mob of a lynch mob and the educated liberal elite as being the enlightened ones, I'd like to maybe suggest that there is not mass support for the death penalty in this country. In fact, people are not clamouring for it, and ordinary people are not demanding it, despite your opinion polls, which I trust, written by the liberal elite, by the way, and published in their newspapers, which I don't trust. Do you?
Well, I mean, every opinion poll taken has shown a clear majority in favour. Yesterday's was over 3,500 people, came out 83%. There was no great public opinion for the abolition of the death penalty in 1965. This was very much I like to see it as sort of a hijacking of a political party, which occurred in the 1950s, the Labour Party in Britain, by people whose main agenda was social reform and penal reform rather than economic reform.
Neil Clark, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Panel, let's swiftly dispose of the utilitarian argument, or at least discuss it before we move on to the moral one. Daniel Troy threw in his survey, which he thought was impressive and well based, that every execution in the United States saves 18 lives. It catches a headline, doesn't it, Janet?
It does, but can I ask you why you say utilitarian as opposed to moral? Because utilitarianism is a moral position. It says that the right action is the one that produces the best consequences. But you don't want to go.
Okay.
I must say the point that struck me about that survey, as one who dabbles a little in social science these days, is by gum. with that kind of social science, you can prove anything.
It is also true that if you said to every child, "We'll behead you if you're naughty," that they might behave better. I mean, this doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, it's probably true that if you have the most repressive authoritarian regime, where if you say anything out of hand, you'll get killed, that you might behave differently. That has absolutely no bearing on anything at all, it seems to me. I really don't think...
So you're accepting the utilitarian argument, but saying it's irrelevant,
I'm saying that from a moral point of view, or even from a political point of view, I don't care. It might well be. I don't think it's proven one way or another that it's a deterrence or not. And I think it's foolish for those people who are opposed to the death penalty to use deterrence as an argument, because you have facetious and silly arguments about how many people it stopped or didn't stop.
Yeah, and
That's not the position.
I think
we
what's
should
been
adopt.
interesting about the discussion this evening, although you've got wildly divergent positions, is that actually people aren't even bothering to use that kind of evidence very much. It is so self-cancelling. That's not really what the argument's about.
David Cook, even Peter Hitchens seemed to grant, in fact almost explicitly did grant, that the process of capital punishment was brutalising for those people who came in contact with it. Was that persuasive from your point of view?
Well, it was rather hilarious because he also wanted it to act as a deterrent, and yet he refused to allow people to watch it, and he alone was worthy of watching and able to tell us how awful it was and we ought not to do it. I'm not quite sure I'm going to be deterred by what Peter says. How deterrence proves a negative, I'm never very sure. And of course, it presupposes you're going to get caught and you're actually going to be punished as well. I wasn't persuaded by that kind of argument, and I think it's back to whether or not retribution is or is not fundamental in the moral sense of people.
What do you think, Janet?
And this is exactly the point we haven't discussed. And the thing that concerns me about all this discussion is that you can't get the question of what penalties there should be straight until you've worked out exactly what punishment's for. And we've had half a dozen things going around the table, and we haven't decided which ones are the important ones.
So what is, in the case of, shall we say, Timothy McVeigh, or one of the more notorious British equivalents, in as much as there can be an equivalent, what sort of punishment is appropriate in your view, and what should it be designed to achieve?
I think it should be designed to achieve the best outcome for society. That is, it shouldn't be retributive and backward-looking. But it's very difficult to know what that is.
Rather
because
wishy-washy, isn't it? Best outcome for society. What does that mean, and how do you calibrate it?
I can't begin to yet, and the fact that you haven't got the answer doesn't mean that you're not pushing in the right direction for finding it. And it's not just about deterrence, it's about all these things about moral attitudes and how people respond to other people and whether they're brutalised, all the rest.
It's about some practical things. It's about making sure that the person can't do it again, and it's about delivering a sense of justice on behalf of a society. But the argument, and it's almost I think it is unique to capital punishment, this argument, that the act of punishment itself is so viciously self-debasing for a society that it is, in my view, not possible to go down that route.
Claire?
We also have to bear in mind the power of the state, and not just the American state. I mean, it was the American state and the FBI and a number of other people who worked for the American state that deprived an awful lot of people at Waco of their lives, women and children, in dubious circumstances. And Timothy McVeigh might well be somebody who has to have his liberty deprived, but these things are politicised as well. I'm not happy to just say he's the bad guy and the state will decide and I trust them. Certainly don't want to trust them with people's lives.
David Cook, but in the end, is not the prevailing argument, and I'm going to ask you for one word here, that actually capital punishment makes the state, and by extension us, morally equivalent to the murderer?
It does. It reduces that, and it removes all possibility of reform.
OK, that's it for this week from our panel: Ian Hargreaves, David Cook, Claire Fox and Janet Radcliffe-Richards, and from me until the same time next week. Good night.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Burke and produced by David Coombs.